In the section that begins on page 475, the author presents, she suggests that maybe she could make up an artificial language, and in this language she might invent several wacky rules. The first rule that she presents there is that first bullet point, that if the subject of the sentence begins with the sound d, reverse the usual order of the verb and the direct object. So that would be like if the subject of your sentence was your dog, that begins with the sound d, then all of a sudden the sentence would not be that the dog played with the toy, but rather it would be the dog the toy played with. Now, that would be such an arbitrary rule that would only apply to the times when you were talking about things that started with d. There are a couple of other wacky rules that she presents there that just would never exist in real languages. And the reason she's proposing these wacky rules is to illustrate a point. The point is, there are certain universal constraints that seem to be imposed on all languages. All languages follow certain rules, and they're not all consistent in the rules that they follow, but they are there is a certain order to the way languages present themselves. They're not wacky, they're not arbitrary like these bullet points that she presents here. Greenberg presented these in a list of 45 linguistic universals. These generalizations had exceptions. Each one of them was a statistical pattern that he observed that on average it seems like most languages that work one way also work another way. He says, for instance, if a language has gender categories in the noun, then it has gender categories in the pronoun. So that would be that's one general rule that he found, that on the whole, that's how it goes. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. There are exceptions to most of these rules, but it seems like most of the time languages exist in some kind of structured way, and we can observe those structures. So that's what Greenberg did. He presented these rules so that we could see whether certain aspects of language were indeed universal and true across all languages, or to what extent there were exceptions. On page 476 at the bottom, we come to this section that begins to describe the meaningfulness of language universals. To what extent are they due to cognitive structures, and to what extent are they due to historical factors? So if we look at different languages across the world, you can see that they stem usually from previous languages. Almost never anymore are languages just invented out of nothing. We've read a couple of examples in the text, like Nicaraguan Sign Language was invented virtually out of nothing. But today, most languages they stem from other languages. On page 480 and 481, you can see a language tree that presents the more ancient languages and when they stemmed and how they stemmed to create more modern languages, the ones that exist here on the earth today. The point that this illustrates here is that when a language stems from a common ancestor language, that usually those languages share common traits in word order, specifically in this chart, but in other ways too. So if you look at this figure 12.3, you can see that that the very first split from the Proto-Indo-European language was between Hittite language and then all the other languages, right? So Hittite was the first language that split off, and then Tocharian split off, and then some other languages kept splitting off, right? But those first few that split off share post-prepositions and object-verb order. But then, once we get to the Germano-Italic languages, those languages usually share prepositions and verb objects. So that's illustrated by the color of these squares and circles, and suggests that, for the most part, languages that share a common ancestor usually share also common word orders and the use of prepositions and objects in the sentences. Because we see that that is true across the world, and if you go back one page to figure 12.12, you can see across this map that the colors of different word orders and preposition usages, they cluster together not only in time but also geographically. Because we see that these historically related languages and geographically related languages share common traits, that suggests that there are certain aspects of language that are inherited rather than being biologically driven. But we can also, but this might be a illusory correlation, meaning it might not be a true correlation. The author presents an analogy. Suppose that you were to find a correlation between, like, a language that used tones, as Chinese does, and you also found that those languages that use tones, people were to eat with chopsticks. Now, is that a meaningful correlation? Probably not. They're not related to each other. It's just that Asian countries are more likely geographically to have inherited the use of tones, but independent of that, they were also likely to inherit the use of chopsticks from ancestors, right? So they're two unrelated factors. It's a correlation. If we were to look across the world, this would be a reliable correlation, but it's an illusory correlation because it's not a meaningful one. It's not because one thing is causing the use of both lexical tones and chopsticks. So given this information, we have to wonder then, how can we piece apart whether a language is sharing traits because it's historically and geographically related to certain ancestors, or if it's because of something going on in the brain. That brings us to section 12.2 on page 481.